November 12, 1917. Chaumont, France. Captain Harvey Cushing stepped off the supply truck into the freezing mud, his boots sinking 2 inches deep before finding solid ground. The air smelled of wet canvas, carbolic acid, and something else, something rotting that he couldn't quite place. Behind him, Lieutenant Nurses Sarah Moore and Eleanor Stimson gathered their medical bags, their breath visible in the pre-dawn mist that clung to the rows of hospital tents stretching toward the horizon. Base Hospital 15 had been operational for 3 weeks, but already the American Expeditionary Force's medical personnel could see this wasn't the war they trained for at medical colleges in Boston and Philadelphia. Cushing, a renowned neurosurgeon from Harvard, had arrived expecting battlefield trauma, shrapnel wounds, bullet injuries, the surgical challenges he'd read about in British medical journals. What he found was something different entirely. "Dr. Cushing, sir." A British medical officer approached, his uniform caked with dried mud up to the knees. Major Thomas Horder extended a hand, his face gaunt, eyes carrying the weight of 3 years' service on the Western Front. "Welcome to France. I'm afraid your orientation will be rather more intense than anticipated." Through the tent flaps behind Horder, Cushing could hear it. A low, continuous sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not screaming, not moaning, but something worse. The sound of hundreds of men whimpering, trembling, some calling out from others in voices that hadn't quite broken into full panic yet. Major Horder led them through the main receiving ward, and what Captain Cushing saw stopped him mid-stride. Lieutenant Moore's hand flew to her mouth. The tent stretched 100 feet long, packed with iron cots positioned so close together a man could barely walk between them. But it wasn't the overcrowding that shocked the American medical team. It was a condition of the patients. On every third cot lay a soldier with his feet exposed, and Cushing's medical training couldn't reconcile what his eyes reported. The feet weren't feet anymore. They were swollen masses of black and necrotic tissue, some oozing yellow-green pus, others so gangrenous the stench overpowered even the carbolic disinfectant. "Trench foot," Horder said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion. "We're treating approximately 4,000 cases per week across the British sector alone. Your American boys in the 1st Division are beginning to show similar numbers." Lieutenant Stimson moved closer to one patient, a French poilu whose feet had swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the skin split open in deep fissures that wept clear fluid. The soldier stared at the ceiling, unblinking, his jaw working soundlessly. How long were they standing in water? Cushing asked, kneeling beside another cot where a British corporal's feet had turned a waxy white, the toes completely black. "Weeks, sometimes months," Horder replied. "The trenches hold water at knee depth during winter. The men stand in it, sleep in it, fight in it. 72 hours of continuous exposure is typically enough to begin tissue death. Many of these men were in the lines for 30, 40 days straight. Type continue to generate the next section." But Major Horder wasn't finished with their orientation. He led Captain Cushing and the nurses through a connecting corridor of duckboards, wooden planks laid across the perpetual mud, toward a smaller cluster of tents set apart from the main hospital complex. The whimpering sound grew louder. "We call this the NYD ward," Horder explained. "Not yet diagnosed, though we all know what it is." Inside, the scene defied everything Cushing had learned about battlefield medicine. 23 men occupied the tent, but only 5 were lying still. The others moved in ways that seemed physically impossible for conscious human beings. A young American private, no older than 19, sat rigid on his cot, both hands locked in a clawed position against his chest, his entire body trembling so violently the cot frame rattled against the wooden floor. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated, seeing something none of them could see. 3 cots down, a Canadian sergeant crawled in tight circles on the ground, his hands and knees working mechanically, his lips moving in an endless repetition. "Going over the top, going over the top, going over the top." Lieutenant Moore approached the British soldier who stood facing the corner of the tent, his forehead pressed against the canvas, both fists pounding a slow, steady rhythm against the fabric. Pound, pound, pound. His knuckles were bleeding, the canvas stained, but he didn't stop. "Shell shock," Horder said. We're seeing it in roughly 30% of men who survived sustained artillery bombardment. The German spring offensive produced over 80,000 cases in 3 months. Captain Cushing moved slowly through the ward, his surgeon's mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. A French lieutenant sat perfectly still on his cot, his uniform buttoned to regulation, his posture ramrod straight, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. He hadn't blinked in the 2 minutes Cushing observed him. "How do you treat this?" Cushing asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Major Horder's laugh was bitter, empty. "We don't. Not really. The British tried electric shock therapy, applying current to convince the men they were malingering. It didn't work. Made some of them worse. Now we give them rest, warm food, try to get them away from the sound of guns." He paused, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "But you hear the artillery, don't you? Even here, 20 miles behind the lines." Cushing did hear it. A distant rumble, like thunder that never stopped, felt more than heard. The percussion of hundreds of thousands of shells being fired along a front that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Lieutenant Stimson had her notebook out, her nursing training demanding she document what she saw. "How many cases total? Between the trench foot, the shell shock. Since 1914? Horder interrupted. "Conservative estimates put British trench foot casualties at 75,000 men. Shell shock cases exceed 100,000. The French numbers are higher. The Germans won't release their figures, but we know they're suffering the same." He gestured toward the main ward. "What you're seeing here, in this one hospital, on this one day, multiplied by 1,000 facilities across France and Belgium." Captain Cushing stood outside the psychology ward as the November sun finally broke through mist, though it brought no warmth. Behind him, the sounds continued. The whimpering, the rhythmic pounding, the endless repetitions of traumatized minds trying to process the unprocessable. Lieutenant Moore sat on an empty ammunition crate, her face pale, while Lieutenant Stimson stared at her notebook, the page still blank despite her best intentions. An ambulance convoy rumbled past, bringing fresh casualties from the Cambrai sector, where British tanks had just launched a major offensive. Cushing knew what would be in those ambulances. More trench foot cases, their feet rotting in boots they couldn't remove in the forward trenches. More shell shock victims, men whose minds had shattered under the weight of the creeping barrage that preceded every assault. Major Horder stood beside him, finishing his cigarette. "Your medical schools didn't prepare you for this, did they?" "No," Cushing admitted. "We trained for surgery, for infection control, for battlefield trauma. Not for this, not for wars where the earth itself becomes a weapon. Where standing in a defensive position for weeks destroys men as effectively as any bullet. The generals call it attrition," Horder said quietly. "Wearing down the enemy through sustained pressure. But disease and madness are winning more battles than bullets and bayonets. For every man killed in combat, 3 are invalided out by trench foot frostbite or psychological collapse." He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot. "Welcome to modern warfare, Captain. Your real education starts now." Inside the wards, the sounds continued and would continue long after the guns finally fell silent.